Bonjour, Kinamage Nene Ireland and Dishnikas, and welcome to this production of Social Studies Explorer. Today, Chapter 5, Section 6, The Boston Tea Party. Section 6, by looking at vocabulary. The word repealed means to take back a law. If I put in place a law in our classroom that you had to bring me 10 donuts a day, and then realized that you weren't going to do it, I could repeal or take it back and make the law no longer count. It does actually happen quite frequently in the world. And the other one is intolerable acts. Those are acts that the American colonists found to be intolerable, or they just couldn't stand it. Before I begin the section, there is a link here to a Boston Tea Party episode. And to get to these, you'll open up the PDF in the Google form, scroll all the way down to page 124, and then click there. I often would recommend hitting Control click. And that'll open up this. I would show it, but it's 23 minutes long. So that's something you could watch during independent work time or at a time of your choosing. The Boston Tea Party. Even though the British repealed the Townshend Acts, they refused to give up the tax on tea. In colonial times, almost everybody drank tea. It was a popular drink like coffee is today. The colonists began to unite in order to fight the tea tax. In 1773, British ships carrying tea sailed into Boston Harbor and other colonial ports. The colonists had prevented the tea from being unloaded in 3 other colonies. And you can see here the image of the Boston Tea Party, although I believe the Boston Tea Party did happen at night, and this clearly is a daytime image. You'll see that the Sons of Liberty dressed up ridiculously as Mohawk Native Americans. Not sure the purpose of that. I could probably find a lot of other disguises that would probably be a little bit less offensive. Just saying. But in Boston, the royal governor refused to allow the tea to be returned to Britain. On a cold December night, Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty, dressed as Mohawk Indians, went on board the ships and threw 342 chests of tea overboard. This became known as the Boston Tea Party. Still no word if somebody threw some sugar in and they just had a grand old time at the world's biggest tea party. Maybe you had some crumpets. The royal governor didn't know who to blame for the crime because the men were disguised. When King George found out about the Tea Party, he wanted Boston to be punished. The British government closed the port of Boston until the colonists paid for the tea. They also banned town meetings and ordered colonists to give food and shelter to British soldiers. The angry colonists called these new laws the Intolerable Acts. The Intolerable Acts were a series of laws that the British made in 1774 in response to the Boston Tea Party. The laws were: first, the Impartial Administration of Justice Act. This law allowed the royal governor of a colony to move trials to other colonies or even to England if he feared that juries in those colonies wouldn't judge a case fairly. And while this is still a thing in the American justice system, it is more likely that this particular act was meant to make sure that colonists wouldn't find the people not guilty. The Massachusetts Bay Regulating Act. This law made all officers subject to appointment by the royal governor and banned all town meetings that didn't have the approval of the royal governor. So, in essence, making sure that the police were going to be on your side and trampling on the ideals that would later become the First Amendment. The Boston Port Act. This law closed the port of Boston until the price of the dump tea was recovered, moved the capital of Massachusetts to Salem, which seems to have such a great history, and made Marblehead the official port of entry for the Massachusetts colony. Quartering Act. This law allowed royal troops to stay in houses or empty buildings if barracks were not available. In essence, tonight when you're about to go to bed, you might get a rap on the door and suddenly you're sleeping on the couch and the soldier has your nice warm bed, maybe even your just right porridge. And there is nothing you could do about it. The reaction to this includes another of our Bill of Rights constitutional amendments. The Quebec Act. This law granted civil government and religious freedom to Catholics living in Quebec. These acts were the cruelest so far of all the acts passed by the British. Closing Boston's port would cost the colonists a lot of money. Banning town meetings made it so colonists could not meet and discuss political problems. The Quartering Acts made colonists angry because they didn't want soldiers in their houses. And the Quebec Act was insulting to colonists who had been denied the same rights that Quebec residents now got. Rather than keep the colonists down, the Intolerable Act stirred the revolutionary spirit to a fever pitch. The following primary source regarding the Intolerable Acts was written by John Andrews. John Andrews, a Boston merchant, writes to his brother-in-law in Philadelphia, May 1774. Yes, Bill, nothing will save us but an entire stopping of trade to both England and the West Indies throughout the continent, and that must be determined both speedily and absolutely. The least hesitation by you to the south and all is over. I sincerely believe they, the British Parliament, tend to carry out their threats, which are to make the town a desolate wilderness and the grass to grow in our streets. And you can see a timeline of events that'll eventually lead us to war from the Proclamation of 1763, where the colonists whined about not being able to encroach on native land through a lot of complaining about taxation without representation. The Boston Massacre, which we've been covering the last few days. Now the Boston Tea Party. And obviously, because we are not singing God Save the Queen before our sporting events, it's going to eventually lead to revolution. I next want to show you a video from the History Channel before I look forward to what's coming.
Back in England, the colonial rebellion becomes a national preoccupation. Over the next 3 years, Parliament keeps trying to impose its authority with new laws and new taxes. As each new law inflames the rebellion, it ends up getting repealed. Except for one, a tax on tea.
The principle involved is that Parliament is sovereign, it can pass laws on whatever it wants. So we're going to just keep this one in place, just because, to assert the fact that we can do this.
The Tea Act puts only a 3-penny tax per pound on the drink of choice for most Americans. It's hardly a burden, but in the current climate, a 3-penny tax still equals oppression. It's all that militant patriots need to strike another blow against the empire. Feathers and coal dust are their weapons. On December 16, 1773, the Sons of Liberty enlist 50 men to darken their faces, stick feathers in their hair, and arm themselves with hatchets in a bad impersonation of Mohawk Indians. 5,000 people follow them down to Boston Harbor and watch as they climb aboard a merchant ship loaded with tea from England. With British soldiers absent since the Boston Massacre, there is no one to stop them. 342 crates of tea worth 10,000 British pounds are cast overboard. This wanton act of sabotage, which becomes known as the Boston Tea Party, will soon push the two sides to the brink of war.
The British reaction was disgust and outrage. From a British point of view, you had an entire colony running amok. And the British government, after the Tea Act, frankly said, we've had enough. We've had enough with Massachusetts. And we're going to clamp down on them. And we're going to make Massachusetts an example of what happens if you defy the authority of Parliament.
As we wrap up this chapter, there are some questions in the Google form for today. We will be having an assessment tomorrow. that'll be graded based on what we've been reading in chapter 5. So if you're inclined to want to skim through chapter 5, it's not a bad idea. Although the questions are going to be things that we've already talked about or answered in the lead up. And then we'll be moving into a new section. And the video is going to provide this musical score to kind of give you an idea of what's coming next week.
Halfway across the globe and we're standing on new ground. Screaming across the waves, you can't hear a sound. There's no fair trials, no train, no liberties, no tea. We've colonized America, we won't stand for tyranny. Okay, and it's too late to apologize. It's too late. I said it's too late to apologize. It's too late. Paid your foolish tax, read the acts, and they just won't do. We wanna make it clear we believe this much is true. All men were created with certain unalienable rights. Among these, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's too late to apologize. It's too late. I said it's too late to apologize. It's too late. Halfway across the globe and we're standing on new ground.
We have now reached the conclusion of this lesson / musical score. Feel free to now close out this video, return to the Google Classroom, and make sure you answer today's questions. Have a minogijigad, minwa, bamapi.